Hey, curious people, you're listening to the Self-Led in Bed podcast, where we explore our fascinating internal sexual landscapes and discover our authentic sexual selves. I'm your host, Patricia Rich, a certified internal family systems and sex therapist, coach, and creator of the Self-Led Sexuality model for healing, pleasure, and empowerment. I've spent the last 30 years helping people to develop fulfilling relationships with themselves and others. If you're ready for some warm, smart, and juicy conversations, me and my parts invite you and your parts to get cozy and settle in. Ever feel stumped about how to respond to a child or teen's sexual question or behavior? Feeling self-led in bed is a lifelong journey, and parents play crucial roles in shaping their children's sexual attitudes, beliefs, and behavior. Yet few parents have been formally prepared for this role, which can activate so many of our own parts. Today's guest, Jennifer Wiessner, has a passion for helping parents raise sexually healthy children. She masterfully combines IFS with sex education so that all parts of parents and their offspring can feel welcomed and free of shame, while also practicing values and boundaries, clearing the path toward healthy adult sexual lives. Jennifer is a licensed clinical social worker, AASECT Certified Sex Therapist, sex educator, couples therapist, and consultant in the state of Maine. She has a private therapy and sexual health consultation practice and sees couples, groups, and adult individuals. She created and facilitates Girls on Fire workshops for teens and the popular Raising Sexually Healthy Children workshops, which educate parents, medical providers, and educators on why talking to youth about sexuality is a healthy, necessary, and normal part of life. Jennifer was the 2023 winner of Maine Family Planning's Significant Contributor Award for Sexual Health Education. Jennifer is a mom to 2 teenage sons and partnered with Greg for 25 years, all of whom inspire her to do her work. Jennifer, I'm so looking forward to our conversation today about raising sexually healthy children, and especially how the IFS lens can really enrich that process. And I just want to welcome you onto the podcast and maybe start out just asking you if you could share where you're located.
Sure. I'm so glad to be here with you, Patty. And I'm located in Cumberland, Maine.
Mm, cool. And is that on the coast? Is that
It's about 15 minutes south, north, excuse me, of Portland, Maine, and it's pretty, yeah, it's kind of coastal. So if you went outside of my house and drove 3 miles that way, I you would hit the ocean, or what we consider the ocean, the bay.
mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Cool.
love it here. Been here for 19 years.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I have lots of ocean and coastal loving parts that dream of living somewhere somewhere like that. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
we love it.
And speaking of parts, I always like to ask guests if you're noticing any parts as we step into this conversation.
Always. Anytime, I think, although I do lots of public speaking and interviewing stuff, it's always that, oh, am I going to say the right thing for somebody or the things they want to hear? Or so a little bit of that, even imposter part occasionally comes up. And I always find that once I'm about, 4 or 5 minutes in, I start to just like be like, oh, I love doing this. But always in the beginning, those parts come up every time. And I have to almost, sit with them and remind them that remember this is that thing you really love to do and educating people, and also it's okay to be here. It's always okay to be scared and be nervous about new things. Absolutely. So
Mhm.
that's definitely there.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. And I have parts that are, I was just saying before we got on, no matter how many times I do things like this, also just get this rush, a little bit of a
Yeah.
rush. Yeah. And also, I'm excited just to talk with you more. I could share that I met you for the first time this past summer when I traveled to Maine and I offered a pop-up workshop, which was something I've been playing around with, and going somewhere beautiful that I'd like to go and trying to offer something while I'm there. And didn't know about you and your work and have been so intrigued since you told me about it. And I'm just wanting to turn it over to you so you could say a little bit about maybe your professional journey and what you're passionate about doing now.
Sure. Yeah, that was a great training. It was great to be there. And as you may remember, I was only a few days out of having ankle reconstructions. I
Mm,
had a colleague drive me there in a
yes.
cast and wasn't sure I was going to kind of get through it, but that's how much it meant to me. Because
Mhm.
anytime there is training, especially nearby, which doesn't happen in Maine that often, on the intersection of sexuality and IFS and just sexuality and anything relating to therapy is just so important to me.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, when I moved to Maine, like I said, about 19 years ago, I was already had finished, my training as a therapist, but I didn't get licensed from my state of New Jersey, where I came from, because I had a child, and I had also had a very traumatic pregnancy and had a pancreatic tumor and like all this different stuff going on. So at that point, I was like, why am I going to get licensed? I don't know what's going to happen for myself, but also where are we going to end up? Because we had made a commitment that if I survived and I lived and our child lived, that we were leaving. We were moving to a place that really felt that resonated for us. And that was, like, to your point, the coast. I have my coastal
Mhm.
parts too.
Mhm.
And so that all did happen. And we moved up here, and then I got licensed up here, and I was working with children and adolescents, really. I was working with children in New Jersey, but then started working with adolescents here, and then started shifting into couples work. And sort of accidentally ended up at a training by Dr. Gina Ogden, who is very well known in our field. And she's a PhD and a shaman. And she came to Portland, Maine, and a colleague of mine said, hey, you want to go to this training? And because I'm a social worker, I went. And I didn't really even know what it was about. And so when I got there and started hearing Gina talk about the intersection of spirituality and sexuality, my mind was blown. I went to 13 years of Catholic school, and really just my belief was those things, what I was taught, never enter the building together, and they certainly don't cohabitate. And so I felt ill, like literally felt sick at the training, but with felt amazing, but felt like I was getting those rushes and feeling overwhelmed. And then in the middle of the training, we had a break, and someone I didn't know, a therapist, who came up to me and he said, do you know who I am? And I said, no. And he said, looks like you're having an experience today. So he noticed something in me. And I said, and I couldn't stop talking then. It was just like, wow, everything I'm learning, it's so important. It's this. I didn't know it existed. I didn't know what a sex therapist was. I didn't really ever think about the intersection of spirituality and sexuality. And so we started chatting, and he just looked at me and he said, I'm 69 years old. He said, I have all this training. I'm the only certified sex therapist in the state of Maine. How about you take this over from me? What? I had two little babies at home, and I will never forget the moment. It's an epiphany moment, because I looked at him in that shocked state, and my hand went out like this, and I shook his hand. But to this day, I still don't know how that happened. And so it still feels like today, I'm like, I can't believe I did that. And I can't believe I've done what I've done. And so over the journey, then training and going through 4 years of training, and then becoming the only female certified sex therapist in Maine at the time. And then, because I was only one of two and one sort of newly trained, I had to learn a lot very quickly. And so sought a lot of different types of training, and over time shifted more into I let go of the adolescent work and was working with couples and individuals. But then I kept waking up in the morning being like, I'm glad I can help these folks, but I wish there was more we could do, sort of, so people wouldn't have to feel this shame and carry it. And one morning just woke up and was like, wait a minute, I educate parents on how to raise their kids in a sexually healthy, developmentally healthy way. Could we get rid of shame and passing that on? And so then that came out of that. Then I created the Raising Sexually Healthy Children workshop series and started doing parent consultations, and then that all the different things just went from there. But it's the thing I've over these, I think I've been doing them about almost 15 years. It's something I've just is so precious to me, especially raising my own two sons and using them as the guinea pigs. They were, I think, 3 and 7 at the time, or yeah, 3 and 6. And so I was doing this work on them, and it's been wonderfully received here. I spent a lot of time building relationships in the community in the state, because it is a little, for some people, I'm like this hockey soccer mom, sex therapist, sex educator, which seemed a little odd for people. And yet it's always been really wonderfully received. And over 5,600 adults have been through the Raising Sexually Healthy workshops here in Maine. So
Wow.
that's that arm of the work that I do, in addition to
Yeah.
private practice and consultations. And
Yeah.
I educate at colleges and high schools. I was at my son's high school, private high school, here in Maine, 2 days ago, teaching about consent and healthy relationships. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, I always say
Wow.
wherever it's needed, I try to be there.
That is just amazing. I just love that story and how ordained it seems, with that hand, like, hey, you're just starting to wake up to what this even is, and then take over my practice.
Yeah,
So, what an amazing journey and sense of mission. And I love the it feels big, like, gosh, if we could really get to the roots of the shame, maybe we could prevent this kind of burdening. And of
exactly.
course, I'm bringing in IFS language, and IFS has also been a part of your journey. And I wonder if you could
Yeah.
say a little bit about when that piece came online.
Absolutely. And actually, I had remembered that you and I actually met even back then. I think you were one of the trainers at one of my early trainings. And I've done level 1 and then have done level 2 with Tony Herbine Blank and did the IFIO, Intimacy from the Inside Out. And then I've done like little weekend refreshers. And I always tell people when I'm describing to them, because I use it in my sex therapy practice and my couples work so much, that it's really the most important thing I have added to my toolbox over the years, because it has a way of getting at content and depth that we can't get, as I say, ping ponging in talk therapy, and then to be able to deal with the type of trauma as well as burdens that we carry relating to our sexuality. It works so well, and I think it works in such a gentle way. So I found that it has been such an important addition to the work that I've done for the past about 10 years, for sure.
Mhm. Yeah. And I can certainly resonate with that, and have, um, you know, had that journey of becoming a sex therapist and then wanting to add on, and then seeing how IFS can really illuminate things. And I'm wondering if, as a parent, like, if you were just kind of, talking to a parent or looking around, a gathering of parents, like, what are some of the questions that parents struggle with that they may or may not even ask out loud?
Yeah, I think even before the question part, I think that parents have this concern and fear and also expectation about being a perfect parent. And what we know is there is no perfect parent, and there is, no one is perfect. And it's possible, though, to sort of be able to parent from a grounded and calm and confident place. And I think in my workshops for parents, particularly, that's what I try to do, is give them education and help them to feel more competent, um, and confident in the information. If you have the knowledge and you know when to bring it, it can sort of calm those fear parts.
Mhm.
And so, um, if you can sort of, and I feel like the most important word that comes to this in any therapy, but especially this, is curiosity. Because if we're in curiosity, we're less in judgment. And when it comes to children and their parts and sexuality, we need to be curious. A
Hmm.
lot of times
Yeah.
children aren't even sure about what they're asking, and we
Yeah.
jump off into conclusion about what we think they're asking. And so when we
Mhm.
can stay curious and say, oh, that's a good question. Tell me more. And be curious with it versus, why did you ask me that? What are you
Mhm.
doing? Who said
Mhm.
that? That's where we start to have them sort of seize up within themselves. And we're certainly not in self when we're reacting in that way.
Yeah. I'm thinking about my parenting experiences, both being parented and also
Yeah.
being a parent. And my kids are now grown, well into their adulthood now. But it's, one thing to want to be self-led, and it's another thing to just be freaked out.
Yes.
Right,
Yes.
because it's always the surprise. Like I feel like there's the proactive, how would I like to educate my children? And then there's the situations, I'm remembering one time when my daughter was maybe 4 and had a, boy she played with all the time. They ran around outside. They always, were great friends. And one time they were playing together at my house and I walked in and they were like humping, like it was like a really heated kind of play thing going on there. And I'm pretty felt like I was super, comfortable around sexuality. But when this was my kid, the first thing I
Yes.
felt was like that, like, you know, fear, and what do I
Yes.
do?
Absolutely.
And should I do something? I don't want to shame anyone. I don't want to, create anything negative here, but I also don't know if I should just look the other way. And all the things. So I just want to,
And that's
curious
the
if you
thing,
could
right?
speak to what gets in
Yeah.
the way before the self energy part, like what gets in the way.
Yeah, yeah. I think, it takes work, right, on our own parts. We have strong feelings, or we may have had even our own experiences from our own past or trauma around our bodies and sexuality or how they were treated, or we were shamed. And so before we can really be at ease with our own child, who may have questions, or maybe they're, as you just described, engaging in some sort of behavior that has caused you to do the and question about what do I do next. It's really about checking in with ourselves about what's going on inside of us. So I always say pausing is our friend. Really taking a moment to slow down and create that space before the reaction, and then before the responding. Because a lot of parents also get concerned that they have to have an answer or be at the ready all the time. With a response. And what we know is that that's not possible. Again, that's back to that perfection idea of like, I'm supposed to know this and I'm supposed to have the answers. Well, no, no. So sometimes being like, so I imagine walking in on that, and that is a very, back to your original question, which was a common question. Parents will often ask, like, how do we react to that? And what I suggest is saying, first you walk in, you see the scene, and if we know childhood development, even just a little bit, like from my 3 hour workshop, you get everything you really need to know in that time. If you know that, like, okay, this is normative behavior generally. And I also know that freaking out is going to put them on alarm and also then make them potentially feel shame. So the best thing to do for me would be to say, hey, hi, looks like people are curious right now. How about we go get a snack? And just sort of calmly, like you're just coming in and asking them to take their shoes off or whatever. And then because it gives yourself a little space and time. And then also go, maybe you get a snack. And then later on, you can always talk to your own child and say, hey, what was happening today? Were you too curious? And I wouldn't go further than that, like suggesting, but usually just to show them that you're curious, like, were you curious, and see what happens. They may shut down a little bit. And then if they don't say anything, you can then also just let them know sort of what is your plan and expectation or guidelines at home. And so you could say something like, it's always good to be curious. I love that about you. And when we're curious about bodies, you can come to me, or we can read that book together that we have. And if you don't have one, we can suggest one, sure. Um, and always remember, we keep our hands to ourselves. Does that make sense? And so you just check for comprehension. But keeping it as sort of what I like to also suggest to parents is that we have been brought up in a culture where we have separated our sexuality and our sexual self, which is a fundamental part of who we are. And we have relegated it to the very dark, cobwebby corner. And what we've done is, and for children, what we know is, and all of us, I usually go like this with my arms in a big round circle and say to parents, our sexuality and our children's sexuality is a part of our ADLs. And ADLs are our activities of daily living. So if you're teaching about toothbrushing and shoe tying and crossing the street, you're also teaching about how we say yes to a hug or no thank you to a hug. It also means how we say before you go jump on your friend when you see them, you ask permission. And then, scaffolding on up. It's how we teach about if you like somebody, how would you communicate that? Beyond that, it's also then as they're reaching into puberty, teaching them everything they need to know about owning a teenage body, how to use it, how to keep it safe, what relationships are like. And so that's sort of the scaffolding of information. But it's so important, back to the beginning of that we really address our own parts first. And I have a document that I use with folks, and I'm happy to offer it to the group today. Like we can give a link or whatever, but I call it the touch document, and it's meant to get in touch with our own feelings, our own values, as well as our judgments around sexuality with regards to parenting our children. And so it's just a bunch of questions with an acronym about what are the things I need to look at. Because I find in all these 5,600 people who have gone through these workshops, that's where they actually get hung up, is sort of not knowing what they feel. And so I can throw this question out to the listeners and to you too, Patty, is that, when you were growing up, did you feel that going into adolescence that you had everything that you needed to make good, solid decisions about your body and how to maintain it, keep it, and share it? Did you get everything you needed to know by adolescence?
I would say no.
Yeah. And the obvious, probably, I would say out of the 5,600, over 5,200 have said, they all just sit there and shake their heads. I just did a workshop last week for a local friend's school, and there were 28 people there, and one person was able to raise their hand, and their parent worked for a reproductive organization. But so it's really just being, honoring, because that's another place we could also get, is we can feel shame for not knowing. And I have to tell people, like, you didn't get this because no one taught you. This isn't some flaw of yours or you should have known. No one taught you. But we can make it different for our kids. We can get educated now. We can show up in a grounded way, become an askable and approachable parent, and we can do that. And even one step outside of that is, even if you feel that you can't, if the trauma is too much, if there are just things that you feel you aren't able to overcome in the time span where your child really needs this information, then designating a trusted adult or a friend who's a nurse or somebody who you feel is a good auntie or uncle to help with this information. And one of the easiest and best ways to do this is what we do culturally with children, which is read books. So there are so many wonderful books out there to read that are developed, literally broken down by age group. So, because that's another thing, like, well, when do I say this? And when do I say that? There are books that will talk you right through that.
So such a wealth of framing there and information. And I'm hearing a bunch of things. If I could just highlight a couple things and invite listeners to notice what stood out for you so far, and what Jennifer's sharing. One is the information gap that as adults, and I want to say even as therapists and people who have advanced degrees as much as I think, it doesn't really, I'm finding it's not based on how much formal education we have or don't have. There's often tremendous gaps, I think, in what we know. And even this reflects the larger culture because even what gets researched and how accessible books are and all that stuff, plays into this too. But anyway, so I love that you've really boiled this down. It sounds like into really digestible, usable information for parents to have. So that's amazing. And I'm going to look at your resource. That sounds amazing too. And then that second piece, which I run into a lot, in my work is the challenge of then emotionally knowing and being able to use it, and I'm just wondering if you could say what gets in the way, when we know what we should be doing. You've spoken a little bit to that already, but I guess maybe even a little more about, what, I don't know, like, what is it, what gets in the way? What makes it so hard to have those conversations?
I think lots of, yeah, I mean, we could come up with a lot. And I think you mentioned a few. There's, just the culture. Just for an example, what came up for me as you said that, because I used that phrasing a couple times 2 days ago when I was standing in front of 38 ninth graders, who I was already warned that don't say anything. So when I would ask a question, they were silent. And in that moment, thinking from sort of an IFS place, it would be very easy for me to not coerce them, but be like, come on, come on. And actually, one of the teachers from the back was like, come on, you know the answer kind of thing. And I thought, I just I wanted to put them at ease. And so I was thinking of their nervous parts. And so what I said was, notice what's happening here right now. What's happening is so much of our everyday, our culture is telling us that talking about this stuff is uncomfortable and weird. And so it makes sense that you're not jumping in to answer. But I'm here to say that knowing your body, taking care of it, knowing how to communicate about what you want and need and things your limits, that is actually what's healthy and normal. And so as you continue to grow, I'd like you to hear those words, that is what is normative, is that we do have agency, we stand up for ourselves, we say what we want, we say what our limits are, and we ask for what we need. And so that's sort of I do that with parents and with students. Like I think, from the IFS perspective, it's super important that we do put people in a state of relaxation, because what gets in the way are those reactions, right? In terms of like IFS and parts, we're attentive to these reactions because, we have a strong reaction to something or someone, and it's a cue that a part or more than a part is at work. And so I'm thinking of your situation earlier, saying walking in on your child and someone else. Like when we get freaked out that our child, is in some sort of behavior, or maybe if you walk in on your preteen or figure out going through their computer that they were watching porn, alarm bells go off inside, and sort of all of our parenting skills kind of drop to the bottom because these alarms are on. And it's in those moments, if we don't have the know-how or skill, we can impart shame unintentionally. And so again, back to that idea is the more that we know about development and we have knowledge about what are the ways and skills that we can have, so those parts don't get so activated, and then we can hopefully respond from a more grounded and self-led space.
Yeah, I mean, it's what's coming to me listening, which is, vulnerability and shame, which are closely related, is so present, in this subject area. And I see this with professionals, I see this with the families and adults I work with. And just as a parent, there's vulnerability and there can so easily be shame. And then that brings up firefighter parts that might want to just avoid it altogether. Let's talk about it next time, or I'm going to let my partner or their other parent, deal with this. Who knows? So there's so many parts that come up when we're looking at things that feel so vulnerable and when there's shame around them. And I wanted to also talk about, when we're talking about the culture, the intense polarization between, on the one hand, the absence of developmentally appropriate conversation and reinforcement of healthy sexuality, but then the deluge of porn and, all kinds of sexually explicit material. And, not to say good or bad about any particular kind of, erotic material, but in terms of the amount of exposure and how kids tend to consume it without anyone to process it with.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. And that is,
yeah.
so when back to a question you asked earlier, I would say some of the top questions that tend to come up from parents have to do around online images. That's one of them for sure. Another one is about like nudity in the home. And like, when should I stop having my kids bathe together? When should I stop showering with my child? Just the feeling of fear and dread about their child becoming sexual, which is such a different perspective than, say, European values or like the Netherlands, where there's an interesting statistic where, and I won't remember the exact number, but it's pretty close. But in the Netherlands, when they research sexual debut, or as in our culture, horribly, we say losing our virginity, which I tell teenagers they're no longer allowed to say, but their sexual debut, um, um, almost like close to 100% will say that it was an enjoyable time and they were glad that they did it. And yet we see almost the opposite for teenage young adults in the US, that I think it's like 70% would say they wish they had waited. And so, like, that's just so unfortunate. And so, helping also parents have a different frame around sexuality as something not tucked in the dark corner, but rather this wonderful place of energy and rite of passage and normality. And there is no parent, I think, that I have met when I've said, "Do you wish for your young adult?" When your child becomes a young adult and adulthood, that you don't wish them to have a good sexual life. They all want that. It's the period between birth and getting there that they have a hard
Yeah.
time. And
Yeah.
it's a tricky thing. So, but again, I feel like I'm just constantly helping. I imagine myself in this big like raft with parents, like we're all paddling up the stream against culture that's telling us this is something that we should completely avoid and we shouldn't talk about. And yet what we know is, look what has happened when we don't.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the, fun parts that I like to talk about in when I'm going to a college class, is just, and I also take on college students, through the same professor, for projects. I have two right now, and have attended my Raising Sexually Healthy Children workshops and getting their perspective on that and what it was like. And there's almost like in a way, a parenting moment for them. They're having this information that they hadn't gotten, and they feel like, wow, it was so helpful to who I am today at 19 or 20. And actually, I'm sorry, I had an intrusive thought of saying, oh my gosh, there's one thing that parents will often, when I'm in the surveys, I give something that was a takeaway. And this next thing that I'm going to say is usually top of the list. And it's something that they find the most challenging and difficult. But two of the most common words that we use with children are the words appropriate and inappropriate. And I tell them in the moment in the workshop, I need you to stop saying those words to children. And they kind of look at me befuddled at first. And then I say to them, those words give zero direction to children, but they impart shame and judgment. So, and because a lot of educators and parents are at these workshops, they're like, oh my gosh. And so and I always tell them, this isn't, again, to shame them. I remember going through this and trying it for myself and realizing, wow, how many times we use that to impart information, but it gives them none. So for example, if your child is in the grocery cart and they have their hands in their pants and you say, Charlie, don't do that. That's inappropriate. It doesn't tell them what you want them to do. It's reactive. and it gives them no direction of, so it's almost like we've truncated it and took out what we want to say and just thrown in these two words. So, and also then there's even the appropriate. It's like, it's this, oh, you've done the appropriate thing. It's the good girl, boy, child thing. And so better to say something like, Charlie, hands in your pants. Now your hands aren't clean and we're at the store touching things. Let's go wash your hands. Remember, you can always do that in your bedroom or the bathroom at home. So giving them time, space, boundary, consent, and also what to do right now without
Right.
saying,
So
without the shame.
good for parenting in lots of areas, and certainly in this area.
Yeah.
I'm even curious there about not clean, if that would, if
I know
that's
that's
the
always a
language
tricky
that you
thing.
would use, or how do you
I
address
think in that
hygiene or like
moment, I
that
would use
piece?
it. Yeah, I think in that moment I would, because I think we could all agree we wouldn't want people touching their genitals and then touching the grocery items. Like, I think we could agree on that. We do need to watch that we are not sending messages about that genitals are an unclean area. It's a tricky thing. And so it's like we wash our hands after we go to the bathroom, that type of thing. But that's why but notice I gave also the additional thing of, you are welcome to do that at home,
That was
in your
really
bedroom or the
nice.
bathroom.
Yeah.
And then notice I didn't say in private. Most children do not understand what private is. And to them, private might be, in the car next to their friend, or private might be in the living room next to their sibling. And again, there's cultural issues, like not issues, cultural considerations around that. What you feel is private is what your values are for your children. In my workshops, I always say, I bring information. You have to bring your values and see how that fits together, because there's values, there's culture, there's religious beliefs, there's spirituality, there's all of this that plays, it intersects with our sexuality. And those are all important factors too, for sure.
Yes. And I think values are so important around, again, all things parenting and around sexuality. And in a way, I feel like that word has become problematic for people in some ways too, because it's associated with maybe certain kinds of values that get spoken for more. And so it's just interesting, I think, to help people slow down and say, really, what's the point of these rules or boundaries? What are you protecting? What's it in service of? And I I like to bring in that discussion of values as well. And I guess in a way, I think I'm curious, talking to communities that may be more conservative. Like, do you work with conservative religious communities and then more progressive, expansive kinds of communities? And do you notice different kinds of parts that show up for people in those communities?
Yeah, and having done this now for so many years, a full decade of doing these, what I call village style workshops, which are going into people's homes or going in, and then there's the public ones like at school, PTA or PA places. And then I even hold them right here in my office. I used to do more of them here, but I get a lot of requests for the village style. So they're all self-selecting, right? And so I did do 2 workshops in what I would consider a little more of a progressive Christian church in Maine. And it was one of the most inspiring, wonderful experiences, because I was coming in bringing some information that was really felt uncomfortable for this congregation. And yet they were so curious. Talk about, they brought their curious parts and wanted to understand about masturbation and why is it okay, and where did this all fit in. And in a way, it's good that I have a background in Catholicism and Christianity, and then I also am a trained sex and faith educator to help those who feel that they want to maintain elements of their Christian faith, but they also know that they've been harmed by it, but they want to find sort of some discernment about how can I integrate these two. And so I do that work too. But then there are just more, Catholicism is likely not to welcome me in. I was left out of a training for a second time because they felt that because I was going to talk about that it's okay for children to be able to explore their own bodies and touch themselves, they said if she's going to say that, she's not welcome. And so I chose not to be. They said I could censor that out, and I didn't feel comfortable doing that. I said, you know, and again, there's the values, and so it's also a management of being accessible to folks, and at the same time, where do I feel I have to bring the information that is necessary, and so balancing those parts too. And there was something else that you had asked that I wanted to respond to, and I can't remember what it was. Sorry.
No problem.
Oh, yes. And you asked about more expansive. So yes, I both in my client practice, but also just people reaching out, and also who have attended my workshops, where there are whether it be everything from gay families to multiple parents to polyamorous families. So yes, and you know what makes up a family is love, and so I feel like regardless of the structure of the family, many of us struggle with some of the same universal struggles around how do we impart information to our children? How do we explain difficult subjects? I think, and again, back in that same, it all belongs in the same basket. I think we equally have a lot of discomfort talking around death, dying, illness, and sexuality with children. So I'm always trying to make sure I'm bringing sexuality into the basket with everything else. This is really not much different. We have to get through our own stuff around it to be able to get there. And what I see is that we can do this. I see it all the time. I see it in people's reviews and surveys, and that they feel relief after getting knowledge and seeing like, oh, this isn't really that hard as I was making it out to be. And I love when I hear that.
Mm-hmm. So in a way, it's a beautiful updating, would you say, of the parts who have been fearful or parts who
Yes.
felt
Love that. Thank you for saying
overwhelmed?
that. That is it.
Yeah.
It's an updating. Like, you are not this child anymore. I did have, which was actually written in sort of through an IFS lens. I forgot about this. One of those the one church that I did, someone had participated that then wrote I guess I don't want to say it's a testimonial, but maybe that's what it is. But that through her own work, her own IFS work, this was so hard for her to attend. And in a way, it felt like a reparenting for her. And through her various parts, she felt so much healing around her sexuality, sort of reliving this as an adult with all the updated information. And that to me was one of the most beautiful things I could have ever hoped to come out of a workshop.
Yeah, that's amazing. And what a service that is.
Yeah. I still hold that
Yeah.
very dear in my heart.
Yeah. Yeah. I think about updating and for, again, there's people listening who may be newer to or brand new to IFS. So I just want to say part of this idea in IFS is that our parts can get kind of stuck in certain time periods and react to things now based on what they knew at that time. So, a kid who was shamed in school for maybe having curiosity and maybe asking a question about sexuality or something and getting shamed for it, maybe is never going to ask another question because that part is still frozen in that shame and humiliation and beating themselves up. Why did I say that? Just as an example. So an update might be when the person can actually connect with that part, or that part is just listening to something and get some different information that's more accurate to the present, that curiosity made perfect sense and it was a great question, and I'm sorry you couldn't get the answer you needed then, but I can give you that answer now.
Exactly.
So I actually incorporate sex education into the healing work with adults who have young parts, who are frozen with a lot of shame and lack of information. And so titrating just that right amount of information for the part is this amazing healing.
Exactly. You're so right. And then, what I have seen in that same vein with attending, being at a workshop like this where it's openly talked about in a very different way, the reality of what your young part was hearing, they probably couldn't comprehend. They probably didn't have of course, the sophistication at that age. And so, like you said, kind of being stuck with that knowledge in your adulthood that you had back then. But now to hear it in a different way, to hear that actually maybe what they experienced was very normative, or actually that thing that they were told they were really bad for is something that is very common for children of that age. Like it's that feeling like, it reparents that part in a way. And I think it can just it's so valuable because not only will it be helping their child, it's also helping their own parts.
Right, right. And then when parents can have a freer feeling or more clarity, more self-leadership in their own sexual relationship, then, that's felt, right? Whether they're or their own feelings about sexuality. What I'm thinking about now is modeling and how, just hearing you and all of your clarity and courage and confidence and all these qualities of self energy around this. I'm sure that when people are at your workshops, they're hearing the information and they're also having an experience of your general attitude and energy around it. And that is, I imagine quite healing and maybe presents a contrast to other ways they've taken in that information.
Yes, I'm not your bad 80s gym teacher teaching that.
Right.
And actually, that is something that is often, told to me afterwards. It's your love, passion. Like people say, you bleed passion. Like you see it, you taste it when you're there because I am so passionate about it. And I let that flow out to people. So it is a very different experience from probably what they have experienced, where it's been, again, with shame, embarrassment. We shouldn't be talking about this. And you're right, the modeling piece is so important too. I usually also in the workshop talk about, thinking about what does intimacy look like in your home, even when you're a single parent. Just how do you show connection and intimacy? And if there's a lot of, degrading comments or things like I've had clients where, slapping on the body parts or slapping your ass or something, like those things send messages. So I usually have people check in with what is the intimacy in your home, and is it what you want to be imparting to your child because they are sucking it up like a sponge. And so sometimes maybe a little calibration or a check-in about is how we are relating, or I am even relating with my child the way that I want them to feel about themselves and feel about in relationship in the future.
Yeah. I love that. And then this modeling, looking at how intimacy is expressed and how it's articulated. And then I'm thinking about adult sexuality and what is said or not said to children about what the adults are doing, and whether that's a single parent, who may not have a consistent partner, or, if there are, parent, two parent home. I'm curious if you have any tips around what kind of languaging to use, or if a child is curious about something they're perceiving, if you have any words to offer or guidance to offer around that.
Oh yeah, because they're attuned, right? They are attuned to our parts, our reactions. They're attuned to all of that, and they're also our lack of saying something, or I usually say in my workshop, because I tend to use a lot of humor, I'm like, kids are like dogs. They can smell it 2 miles away. And so couple things that come up when you're with your question is, I have sat with many a parent who has talked about, like, oh, we can't let our kids know we have sex. And I'm like, okay, tell me more. Tell me more and the why. And they often can't come up with a why. Or if they do, it's very shameful stuff. It's bad, it's dirty, it's this, I was taught this. Or sometimes their upbringing was that they never saw their parents really even touch at all. And so they don't have a model of what that would look like, anything outside the bedroom. And so I remember when my kiddos were little, and again, this was through all the learning that I was doing, that I was using. But I remember saying to my kids when they'd be like, one more story, come on, one more story, when they were little and they were going to bed. And I would say to them, nope, our time is done. We had all this lovey time and we read our book and I've tucked you in. And now it's time for dad and I to have some of our special cuddle time. And I usually said something like, it's our connection and love that brought you here. We have to make sure we're taking care of it. And so I would tell them things like that. And they seemed to understand it and it worked. So, okay. So that's one thing. That's sort of more when they're younger and you're not going into the stuff. Now, there's always the time where a kid may walk in. Nothing could be, I think, more triggering than that. And then I usually throw in humor and say, look, if your doors don't lock, turn the lights off and in the outside room and throw Legos all over the floor, because as they run in to grab the door, they're going to step on those and scream. And you're going to have at least a moment of advance notice, preferably slide a chair under the inside of the door. But, really preparing, so and it's not so to prepare to keep something secret. It's to prepare for not having an awkward situation. That's why I also say, parents, lock up your sex toys in a safe, please, because otherwise they're going to come to you and say, Dad or Mom, I didn't know you were a superhero by night and you had handcuffs and a cape, So just really taking care of those things. But if things like that do happen, they walk in and they're like, what's going on? Our tendency is to, to fight, flight, freeze, fawn, everything. And probably say something we probably don't want to say. But what we would do is say, oh, honey, why don't you just head out to the couch? I'll be right with you. And that's when you pull the covers up, put on a robe and go out and say, and then it again depends on age, depends on what was happening. If you're hanging from a chandelier or that it was just you were cuddled up together. Like, again, we might talk about special type of loving that goes on between adults that care about each other. I mean, there's so many different layers of things. It could be if it's an older child, like hopefully it's not the first time you're having a conversation about what sexual behavior is, but maybe it is. But that's why generally by the age, it's recommended by about age 7 that kids start to understand that there's behavior that's sexual that adults have. Because they do start asking about where they've come from. They want to understand, like my son learned, he used to say he was born in a petri dish when he was really little because he was an IVF baby. We're like, no, you weren't born in a petri dish, but yeah, you did spend a little time there. And so, learning about how children come into families, there's wonderful books about that, all the different ways. There's ways about describing what everything from, touching, what's healthy touching, what's not healthy touching, or safe or unsafe touching. There's what intercourse is. All of these types of things we scaffold over time. But by age 7, they should have an idea of that people can come together in different ways to create a baby. And that's always reproduction is often a standard place for people to start. And so my second child's sort of coming into the world is very different than my first child who was born in a petri dish. So, having these conversations, my recommendations are always be one developmental stage ahead. So if they are, they're age 5 and 6, you are going to be preparing to talk about these topics about how children come into families and reproduction and how bodies work. There's some great books about sort of the sciencey stuff, but also then the relational and touch piece. If they're, 3 to 5, it's great to talk about, again, I talked about like healthy boundaries where you begin and end. I often have parents who say, my child walks up to me in the bathroom and is pulling my penis. Like, this is horrible. And I'm like, they're curious. They would pull that. They would probably pull, anything over here that they could grab. They're curious about all of these things. And if we can make sure that we try to ground ourselves with the reminder that all of these things are part of curiosity. And it's not that they're pulling on a penis as the thing that's going to be, oh my gosh, it's so bad. No, it's actually just another thing that they're curious about. And so in that moment, for the dad who said that to me, I said, you might want to say, ooh, that doesn't feel so good. You're tugging on my body part. That's my penis. You're welcome to touch your own penis if they have one, if not, or your own genitals, but please don't pull on mine. And so setting a healthy boundary, because that is something you don't want them doing to anyone else.
Right, right.
And the
And how
same thing,
much
whether it's,
self energy is required to do that again, right? Like again, there's
yeah,
the for some people, and I think again, this cultural piece, just the family culture you grew up in, what your life has been like. For some
yes,
people, it's just really easy. It's natural. It's not particularly charged, maybe a little bit, but it's just like maybe a little funny, like, it's light.
yeah,
And for others, it's so um alarming, like the
alarming.
mind can go
Yeah,
blank. And
yep.
so this I'm appreciating like the ideal scenario, and then just imagining some people listening who are like that. I don't think I could say that or do that, and I'm wondering what you think about practice. Like, do
100%.
you have any
And
suggestions for adults to
yes,
practice before they're trying to have these conversations, maybe with their kids?
100%. And what I usually suggest, two things. One is when anyone that I know has a child, they get all the books from me. That's their gift. I
Hmm.
give like a stack and I tie a big bow around them, and say to them, just like you were reading about bringing a child into your family, whether it's pregnancy, adoption, surrogacy, whatever it is, you got information. You're also getting information on how to care for this child, everything from the umbilical cord to wiping their bottoms. Like, you get information. This just needs to be part of that information so you can be prepared. Because to your point, Patty, it can be one of the most alarming things when they happen, and we're not always going to be in self when we're able to respond. So the start before birth, start at birth. I love when parents come to workshops, either babes in arms or they're pregnant, because I know that they're going to get so much information that happens from birth. We are sexual beings from birth. And everything from how we wash their genitals, and how when they go to touch them, we don't slap them away or say, don't do that. Like, all of these things we wouldn't know unless we've gotten this sort of messaging before we even have these
Hmm.
children in our lives. And so doing that, and reading, getting these books, these kids books. And I would say to the parents, read the kids books before you ever have these conversations, before you ever talk to them, because then you're going to understand the format. What are sort of the things that are queasy for me? What are
Hmm.
the things that I'm really strong in? What needs some development? And what maybe there are things that you're like, oh, how does my culture or my beliefs, my values overlay this? That
Hmm.
is critically important.
Hmm.
So the practice is important. I usually tell parents, if there's a word you struggle with, I mean, historically it used to be like, oh, I can't say vulva. And I'm like, okay, well then practice saying it in the car by yourself, practice saying it in the mirror, saying it. And that's what I love about village style workshops, where they come together as people that, they all invited each other, like it's a friend group or some sort of knitting club or whatever.
Hmm.
And they come together because then they can all support each other, and they
Hmm.
practice. We do dyad practicing. And so practice is huge. Practice, practice, practice.
Hmm.
This is like, I wouldn't expect, Patty, do you play an instrument?
Not currently. I took
Okay.
piano lessons.
Okay.
Can't say I
Well,
mastered
then
it.
I wouldn't expect you to be able to pick up a violin and play. This is no different. This is
Hmm.
like learning a new language, especially if the language was very different that we were given growing up.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
practice, practice, practice.
Yeah, I
And there
love
are so many
that.
wonderful podcasts and
Picturing dyads, and I'm interested in what a dyad might do together. Is it practicing the words? Just
I have them practice questions.
hmm.
Yeah, because in an earlier dyad, we go over sort of, what was your first memory of anything relating to bodies or sex or anything? And I always give them, hey, if any of this feels triggering, always take care of yourself. You don't need to participate in a dyad. But then, we talk about what was that like, whatever the first thing we ever heard about what a body or sex was, and then how did it make us feel? So what did you find out? Um, where did it come from? And then how did it make you feel? And we usually have some rich conversation. And then later in the group, we're practicing after we learn a model of how to answer kids' questions. We then do some practice questions.
Hmm. Wow. That
And if
sounds
parents take away
amazing.
nothing
Yeah.
today,
Hmm.
if they take away nothing today, the most important thing, and I think you know this too, Patty, for adults in therapy, like one of the most important things we can give and offer is a space of permission. And so whether it be for adults to come to us and share, what they need to about their history, their sexuality, their problems with that, and for for parents with children, the best thing they can do is when their child comes to them, I'm I won't say the word because maybe I'm not supposed to say it in the podcast, but my child at 6 years old came to me and said, "What is FUCK?"
Hmm.
And so you can just be like thrown off. And the best thing that you can respond is, "Oh, that's a good question." That creates just a neutrality. It's a space of saying, I welcome everything that you say. If you
Hmm.
had asked me, what is diatomaceous earth? Or you've asked me, what is FUCK? And so permission giving lets your kids see that you are someone that is approachable. And working on that is really the best place to start, is really being
Hmm.
able to offer your kid permission to say whatever they want to say to
Hmm.
you, and you won't become overly reactive.
Yeah. Yeah. Great advice. And it makes me think about perfectionism also that can come
Mm,
up. You talked about that at the beginning as a parent, that none of us are perfect
yes.
parents. And I want to say those of us who are therapists or even sex therapists doesn't mean that we have everything figured out. We've nailed it
Nope.
every time. Right. And so I think the idea of repairs is important too. Or if we didn't handle it great, maybe we said something or we were a little reactive, or our discomfort came through, to remember that you can circle back and
Always.
speak for
And
your own
that's a whole
experience.
slide that I do on repair. And even I suggest some people, if, because I say, you might be sitting here thinking, especially for the 9 to 17 age group parents, you might be thinking, oh no, I've been doing this wrong.
Hmm.
It's not that you've been doing it wrong. You've been doing it as well as you could with the information that you had and the way that you could manage inside. And so you can always start out by going home tonight and saying, you know what, I learned some new information today. And it made me wonder that maybe I haven't been as open to talking about whatever the thing is, bodies, sexuality.
Hmm.
And I wanted to let you know I'm going to get better at that. And what I've realized is that my parents never did this for me. So I didn't know how to do it for you, but I'm going to do a better job of it. And I think there's a humanity there. There's a repair. There's also, I think I grew up with parents who, like, there was no apologizing. Apologizing, I think, meant you were relinquishing power. And so I feel like I always wanted to be able to be able to apologize to my kids. And so when it's not going well, going back and saying, I didn't do this so well, or maybe you gave way too much information when they asked a question. And that night, maybe you tuck them in and say, you know what, I probably gave you too much information today. And, how do you feel about that? Maybe they'll answer, maybe they won't, but let them know that I'm going to try to do better next time. And so I think that is the most beautiful gift we
Hmm.
can give kids, is
Right.
repair and acknowledgement that maybe we misstepped in some way or
Hmm.
just didn't do it as well as we would have hoped.
Hmm. And just loving all these little scripts, that you're sharing in terms of how to language these things. And then it also makes me think about that self-compassion, right? Because then when that
So
parent has
important.
tucked the kid in, goes to their own room, are they clobbering themselves, or are they able to have some grace, or are we able to
Yeah.
have some grace with ourselves and our own struggles or limits or wounds, or learning curves?
Yeah,
And
we have to have grace for
mhm,
ourselves. No one gave us a manual for doing this, any of this parenting. And so, and especially for this, where there isn't there isn't all this cultural support and it's sort of just embedded in our culture. No, we're sort of, like
mhm,
I said, we're paddling this raft up
mhm.
against the tide together.
Yeah.
But in the end, I think the impact can be so incredibly powerful for kids
Mhm,
who know themselves, know themselves, know their bodies, know what safety is. It protects them from predators, from abuse. In addition to that, we also then have, I hear from young women about just never feeling the idea of what agency is. I only know how to say no. I don't know how to say yes. So even feeling confident and calm in your own body and knowing and being taught that it's important to know what you want and what you don't want. And so I feel like all of that stuff is, yes, it's part of sexuality, but it's also just a part of being human and being a healthy and I can't think of another word, but just a healthy human.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we're almost to the end here. And of course, this podcast is called Self-Led in Bed. And it's about this. I'm just so grateful for what you're sharing, because this piece of education, communication, and how do we find our self-energy so we can be self-led, as not only in bed and beyond, that we could be self-led in raising our kids and helping them be self-led in their sexual lives. And I'm just,
Absolutely.
again, really so grateful for everything you've shared with us. And I'm wondering if you want to, do you have any last thoughts you want to share? And then maybe some, I'll put in the show notes some resources you shared with us, but if you want to say aloud anything about how people could find you or your work, you can do that too.
Sure. I think I'm listening to my parts, and the part that's coming up is just, I can't say it enough about not only are we, if we misstep or say too much or answer in a way that maybe we didn't want to, not only is it repair with our child, but also repair with ourselves, that compassion and making sure that we're doing that, because that is so important to this whole equation. You people are welcome to find me. I don't do a ton of social media, but I am on Instagram at J Wiessner Sex Therapist, and I post some things there. And you can find me on my website at jenniferwiessnerhealthysexuality.com. And what's great is I can do virtual workshops. I do parent consultations for those who are more squeamish about the group and environment, or feel that they have a very particular issue. I get a lot of emergent issues from parents where something's going on that they need guidance on. And so I do both resourcing calls. Those are just more call me and I will answer your questions. But then there's the consultation where I create an entire plan around how you can, with your child in the stage that they're in and beyond, how can you raise a sexually healthy child? And so you can find all that on my Jennifer Wiessner healthysexuality.com website.
Fantastic. Would you feel like sharing something that you find enjoyable or pleasurable? It doesn't need to be in bed. Say that. Mind your boundaries. But it's welcome if you want to. But just like to ask the guests as we wind down, what are some things that you find pleasurable, or one thing that you find pleasurable?
I will say, just as someone who has chronic Lyme disease and has also had about 18 different surgeries, I used to feel like so much has been taken away from me. That used to be a way I'd think. And so a lot of the things that I did enjoy, I haven't been able to do for decades now. But it's really settled. I've settled into all the things that are new that I now do. So I love to work out energy through indoor cycling, because that I can still do. But I think the thing that I look forward to, in addition to right now, I have a 17-year-old son and a 20-year-old, and I love any time that I can spend with them, because I understand the preciousness of it. And spending time with my husband and of 27 years. But the king here is Mr. Bingley, the white West Highland Terrier, who I love to snuggle. I love to walk. We walk in the woods together. That feels very spiritual for me. We just go into the woods and meander, and I just love that. And that to me, like, fills me up. So that's super pleasurable for me.
Wonderful. Well, I hope you get to enjoy your dog and your family and all these things in the coming weekend. And thank you again so much for being a guest on Self-Led in Bed.
Thank you so much, Patty.
Thank you for listening to the Self-Led in Bed podcast. Check us out at www.patriciarich.com/podcast, where you can sign up for a free guide to the 6 S's of sexual self-energy. And if you liked this episode, please subscribe and share it with a friend. Until next time.